I'm going to talk a little bit about some work I've been doing looking at the effects of changing ecosystems on the ecology of small mammals in particular. And let's see, like that, or maybe this. Okay. The screen is exciting to me, so I might have to play with the screen the whole time. Just before I wade into the research, I should point out that that there are a lot of people who have worked with me on this research, and I'm not necessarily going to do a great job of calling out all the things that that they do, but this is not work that I have done by myself. So my graduate student Amanda Pang and I have worked on a lot of the data gathering for this together. I'm actually using a bunch of data that Elena pulled out of the NOW database, and so she's one of the people that we've talked with about some of this this research. And then there's a whole group of people who work on fossil rodents in various different ways on the evolution of community structure and so forth in fossil rodents that I've talked with about this research. And so all of this is, like so much of science, a collective endeavor, right? I'm the one up here talking, but I don't want to take credit for the work that all of these folks have done with me. Yeah, oh, it goes the other way. Okay. Okay, and so I want to talk about this in part because one of the things that got me interested in science when I was an undergraduate was actually conservation biology. I was really passionate about questions of conservation and how we might protect ecosystems going forward, and how we might deal with all the things that people are doing to ecosystems. And paleoecology may not be the thing that you think of first when you're thinking about conservation biology, but there's some really important roles for the fossil record to play when we think about conservation, when we think about the effects of land use change on ecosystems and on biodiversity, for example. We don't have a great history to look at, right? We have the history of what people have done, which is, one time, right? We've changed the landscape, and these are the things that have happened. But if we look in the fossil record, we can look at how the structure of ecosystems have changed, at how landscapes have changed, and how biodiversity has responded to that. So it gives us more sort of opportunity to look at how those changes might have happened. We can get a better understanding of changing water, precipitation regimes, changing climate, and things like that if we look back in the fossil record. And I'll show you just an example of this. Many of us are familiar with this curve, right, with climate over the last few, maybe 1,000 years, right? And that for a long time things were pretty static, and then humans started burning fossil fuels, and we did this. And so we look at this and we think this is a climate change problem that we have to deal with, and that ecosystems will have to confront. And we don't know what this will do on the basis of what's going on now, because it's still going, right? And we haven't gotten to the end yet. But I'll point out that this climate history is right here. Okay, and here's the last 65 million years of climate change. This isn't to say that the ongoing climate change isn't a problem. It's a huge problem. It's going to change some things, okay? This shows you how instantaneous it is. Here's where we are right now. It's this much above what was going on for 5 million years before that, right? So really dramatic change and really scary and exciting. But at the same time, we've been way warmer in the past. And so maybe the fossil record might have something to tell us about what ecosystems look like then. It might tell us something about how different a stable ecosystem would be that was that warm. It can even tell us something about what rapid warming looks like. Here's an event about 55 million years ago that we call the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, when climate change seemed to have happened about as fast as it is happening right now. And this is only 10 million years after the dinosaurs went extinct, right? And so brand new mammalian ecosystem, and then, dramatic warming event. What happened then? We're working on that, right? But this is a record that can tell us something about where we're going, because where we are right now, we can see some things about what's going on and where we're going. But it'd be nice to look at what's happened in the past when these kinds of changes happen, so that we can anticipate what kinds of processes might go on, so that we can have some sense of like what would tell us something's going really wrong, right? How do you know when the ecosystem's about to change in a really profound fashion? We can see that in the fossil record because these changes have happened and have resolved themselves, and it's been millions of years. Okay, so this is maybe a reason why paleoecology is useful, even though we're thinking about modern biological problems. So that's my hopeful statement about why paleoecology is useful. I'm now going to admit some of the ways in which paleoecology has some challenges that modern biology does not. One of the things is that we have very limited proxies available to us for ecology. So if we want to understand the ecology of things that are extinct, basically, if it's not in the skeleton, we're probably not going to have a great record of it, right? Because the squishy parts of animals just don't preserve worth a darn, right? So I work on vertebrates, and vertebrates are, things that are mostly preserved as skeletons in the fossil record. The parts that can tell us about ecology for the fossil record are basically bones and teeth. And beyond that, it really helps if that part of the skeleton that tells us about anatomy or about ecology is one that we can also identify taxonomically. We can tell what species it is, right? So for example, here are some illustrations of some measurements you can take on the skeleton that tell you something about ecology. Really cool. This is a femur. There are a lot of species for which a femur is not a particularly diagnostic element, okay? Rodents, their femora all mostly look the same unless they're really adapted for particular ecologies, okay? Humeri, these are the upper arm bone, they're a little bit better. You can see this is a really, if you know humeri, this is a really wacky looking one. It doesn't look at all like a human one. They can tell you a lot about ecology, and they're a little more identifiable, especially in things like this animal that's digging, right? But you often can't get at ecological subtleties. So that's kind of one of the unfortunate things about paleoecology. It's ecology with a sledgehammer, right? It's big picture. The interactions between species are often quite poorly known, right? Because they're dead and they don't interact, right? They're bones, right? And so sometimes we can see evidence of ways they interacted in the past, but only if it leaves a mark on the skeleton or if it puts them in the same place in the dirt, right? So we're limited here too. But we can assess the major ecological characteristics of a vertebrate fauna. We can talk about community structure. We can look at body size. Okay, turns out the size of your teeth is pretty tightly correlated with the size of your body. There's some good regression equations. You can basically take the measurements of a molar and use it to infer the sort of species average body size of something. Diet, turns out teeth look profoundly different depending on what you eat. One of the things that we often look at is how high the tooth crowns are. You can see this is sort of low like yours. It's just a little crown they don't wear during life. This is a porcupine. They have really tall tooth crowns and they wear, and you can see this is worn into the dentin, the inside of the tooth, right? That difference reflects a difference in diet, right? Their teeth grow differently based on what they eat. So that can be useful. And then we can learn some things about habitat use, about locomotion, right? How things got around from the shape of their bones. Okay. We also learn this from the skull if we need to. Skulls are great because they're really identifiable, but they're not always completely preserved. So sometimes we like to use limb elements, but we can get a sense of ecology from bones. Okay. So there are some things we can understand about ecology, which is good because, as I said, we want to understand some things about how ecology changes through time so that we can figure out what are the processes that shape this. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ecosystem changes that we see in the Cenozoic, so in the last 65 million years since the extinction of the dinosaurs. And there's several reasons why I think this is a great study system if we're thinking about paleoecology. One of them is that it is a mammal-dominated ecosystem like we have today, right? So our terrestrial ecosystems, at least, are mostly, a system where the big obvious animals you see are largely birds and mammals, things like that. So the things that are part of the ecosystems over the last 65 million years are similar to what they are today. We also know more about it than we do about times before because there's more preserved, right? The longer it's been, the more time there's been for the rocks to be eroded away and lost completely. So if you want to work in relatively recent time, then you get more data. And so this is something I've been working on for a long time. And there's a big, profound ecosystem change that we know about during the Cenozoic. So if you go back in what we call the Paleogene, so sort of the first half, a little more, first 2/3 of the Cenozoic, things are relatively warm, relatively moist, high precipitation, globally, pretty warm and wet relative to today. And so ecosystems are relatively close. There's a lot more forested ecosystems than today. Okay. As you get into the last 20 million years or so, things get a lot more closed, or sorry, a lot more open. Okay, you get more grasslands, more deserts, more savannas, more open habitats. And so you get a pretty profound change in what the landscape looks like. And you also get some profound changes in what the animals look like in response to that. So this is cool because this is one of those conservation moments, right? Like, oh, what happens when you have aridification? What happens when you have landscape change and deforestation, right? What changes happen to the faunas when you do this, okay? It's also a classic evolutionary story, right? Most of us have heard of the story of the evolution of horses, right? This is an image from W.D. Matthews' book in 1926, but you know, Darwin knew a little bit about this story. You know, Cope and Marsh made a big deal of it. It's something that school children are taught in, you know, middle school and that kind of thing. That horses started out, you know, back early in the Cenozoic, very small, sort of like the size of a medium-sized dog. And as this environmental change happened, horses got bigger. They got higher crown teeth as their diet changed, and their feet changed structure from feet kind of like the dog, right? These little multi-toed feet where they were running around on lots of toes, to the reduction to the modern horse that has the one toe, it's very elongated, the limbs are long, and they're really adapted to running, right? So major ecological changes in the way that horses work, right? We've all heard this story with the changes in the ecosystem. And this is also a great example of the problems that we have when we rely on limited records of faunal change, right? We know a lot about horses. If we look at the, you know, diagrams of ecosystems in the last 20 million years, right? We see these open habitats, and look at this beautiful drawing. We have all these big mammals, right? And we know a lot about the big mammals on these ecosystems, right? But we don't know as much about what the little mammals do. And when I finished graduate school in 2005, this was kind of where we were. Everybody was telling the story about the big mammals, about the ungulates, and about the carnivores, and the ways that the ungulates changed in response to this. And I asked, what did the rodents do? And no one could really tell me, right? This was not I was like, okay, but rodents are most of the ecosystem, right? Like, what are they doing? And people were like, well, I think there's some stuff going on, right? Like, but it's not really a story we're telling. It's like, I want to tell this, right? Because I've always been interested in rodents, and so I asked this question, and you know, we know a lot about what the large mammals are doing. We know a lot about what the ecosystem is doing. So this is an image from Christine Janis's work. So Christine is an ungulate paleobiologist, paleoecologist. And here is the last 25 million years. And this is a plot of the number of genera, so higher taxon, based on their teeth. So B is brachydont, they're things with low crown teeth like ours. M is mesodont, they're sort of like slightly higher crown teeth, and H is the hypsilon things, the things with really tall teeth. And this study, like the work that people have done on horses, really reflects our understanding of what teeth do in response to these open habitats. It's a little bit subtler than that horse story tells you, because it's not as simple as the things with low crown teeth become things with high crown teeth. It's actually, you have things with low crown teeth. As habitats get more open, you add things with higher crown teeth also, and for a while you probably have mosaic of habitats where there are some things living in open habitat, in the little open habitat patches and eating grass, which abrades your teeth. You have things probably still living in little bits of forests and eating, leaves of trees, which are not as abrasive. And then at some point, those habitat patches of forest get smaller and smaller. So you sort of lose the things with the lower crown teeth because they just don't have enough trees to eat. And you're left just with these things that can eat more abrasive food. Okay, so that's an interesting thing going on process-wise. It's not a simple replacement. It's actually initially a diversification and then a loss of habitats big enough to sustain things. Okay, but this graph is based entirely on the record of the Great Plains of North America. So basically Nebraska and Oklahoma and Texas, right? This isn't even all of North America that we're telling this story on. But it was in nature, and like everybody went, grassland spreader, grasslands, ungulates, this is what's happening, right? This is how it works, right? And this is a paleobotanical record, but from the Great Plains of North America, right? Cool. Does it happen everywhere that way? I don't know. We're relying on a very limited record. Okay, so we're using a good record. The Great Plains has a great fossil record for this time period, but not all of it, not all the animals, not all the places. So what happens if we look a little more broadly? Well, so Josh Samuels and I asked this question of rodents. What do the rodents do when all of these ungulates are getting higher crown teeth? So this is a graph very similar to that one I just showed you. The bottom level are brachydont or low crown teeth. These are the mesodont or the sort of slightly higher crown teeth. Here are hypsilodont, things with high crowns. And then rodents do this thing we call hypsilodont, where they just don't ever make roots in their teeth. They can just grow their teeth forever. If they lived 1 million years, they would keep growing more teeth, so their teeth would never wear down. Okay, ungulates don't really do this except in South America, which is special. So what happens if you look at the rodents? Well, you actually see, if you look at just the raw diversity, you see a similar pattern, right? So for a long time, there's a dominance of brachydont things, and then here you add the things with higher crown teeth, okay? But this is 30 million years ago. This is before the ungulates even contemplate doing this, right? The rodents are like, guys, it's coming, right? Here it is, right? So you can see the signal of open habitats earlier in small mammals than you do in ungulates. That's interesting, right? And they do the same thing where, later on, you basically lose the lower crown teeth because there's just not enough space, but they're sustained for longer and they come back periodically when there's a little bit more expansion of those habitats. So we have some evidence, for example, at 15 million years ago that we get an increase in those kinds of habitats, right? And if you like looking at proportionally, here's just this is the same graph, only graphed up to a percentage rather than the number of taxa. And you can see that basically over time, you see more and more things with higher crown teeth. So that's interesting. But I mentioned that we can look at not only diet, right, how diets are changing towards more abrasive foods, but we can also look at other aspects of mammal ecology. Here's an example of that. So with small mammals, we can look at how they get around, so their habitat use. So I've categorized these things, and I don't want you to worry too much about what the different categories are. The blue here are semi-aquatic things like beavers and muskrats and that sort of thing. These three types cursorial are running or jumping taxa. We have some jumpers, some specialized hopping taxa. We have burrowing species. These three are common often in open habitats. If you think about deserts or grasslands, you see, gerbils and lots of moles and mole rats and things like that that like to dig, right? These two, gliding and arboreal, are more common in forested habitats. So these are some indicators of more closed habitats. And then there are a lot of rodents where they can do all of it, right? Think about chipmunks, for example, or mice, right? Like, yeah, they can climb, they can dig, they can, they can't glide, right? But, they can kind of do a lot of the other stuff. Okay, so there's a lot of rodents we don't know much about, but we can look at some of them and we see a couple of things. One is, here's that earlier period when things were more forested. You see lots of rodents diversifying into arboreal and even gliding roles. And then somewhere around the same time as they get higher crown teeth, they also start digging, right? So burrowing, these brown taxa here. Later on we see jumping and running, so things trying to cover ground, right? Trying to get over these more open spaces. But we also see some semi-aquatic forms evolving, right? So they're using all the ecology, all right? But some parallel changes in their habitat use to what we see in their diets, all right? But reliance on limited data sets, these are just North American rodents, okay? There's one big book that puts all this together. It makes it really easy to look at this through time. And so when we did this the first time, we used the big book and we put all this data together, but it's only for North America. So the question has to be asked, is this, and the story we're telling from the ungulates and the story we're telling from the grasses, like we're writing these papers about how things change through the Cenozoic, but are we just writing about North America, right? There's a little bit of a history of that, right? We've done this. So I wanted to ask the question that what if you left North America? Does it happen the same way elsewhere? Because we're telling the story around that climate change, around the cooling through the last 40 million years or something like that, that this is a result of climate change, but that climate change is global. So is the change in ecology global? Right, so how does that look if you went elsewhere? Because at this point, 14 million years ago, the configuration of climates or continents is pretty similar to what it is today, other than that Europe is a little bit more of an island chain than it is now. Uh-oh, me and the did I do that? I did. Okay, I'll stop touching it. It's better. Me and smart horns, right? So we can look at the European and Asian records and see them almost as an independent check on what's going on in North America, because there's some connection. There are a few things that get across up here, but it's not all the time, and it's not a huge amount of exchange. So they're, as ecosystems, they're fairly independent. Okay. So the reason that I'm comparing North America with Asia and Europe is that we do have some well-sampled and well-published records in Asia and Europe. I would love to compare this with Africa and South America and Australia as well. It's even possible to compare it with Antarctica, because Antarctica has a pretty good fauna until pretty late in this process, but all of those have major publication biases, major sampling biases, and the reasons for those are, social as much as anything, right? It's where do people have the funding and the resources to do this work and the incentive to publish it. But so I've pulled the data to do this, and this is a first attempt. This is data that Elena pulled from the NOW database, which is it's called the New and Old Worlds database. It was originally just the neogene of the Old World, and so it has a really strong record for the last 25 million years. They're working on building it back into the older time periods. As you'll see in a minute, some of those records are not quite as great. Some of the ecological data are available from this database. It requires a lot more work on my part to backfill ecological data that aren't in the database. It's not as extensive in this as it is in the book that I had to work from for North America. So I've gone in and coded in the tooth crown height and the habitat use from the literature, from things that we know about these species. Happily, there's a lot of publications about paleoecology and these different taxa, and so I've added this in. So, you know, we're talking thousands and thousands of occurrences. The European record is about 12,000 records here. The Asian record, a little bit less well sampled, something like 2,700 records. Although there's probably more to be had, it's just not all databased yet. So what does it look like if you compare the data I had from North America to what we see in Europe and Asia? So here is my North American data. I apologize that the graphs aren't exactly the same. I've never loved these graphs. My collaborator made them, and we had lots of arguments about how they should look, and I think he won, and that's fair. So I've made some slightly different graphs for the data from Europe and Asia, but it's the same categories. That is low crowned, mesodont, hypsodont, hypsilodont, right? And they're stacked in the same way. So lower crown to higher crown. Here is just the raw diversity, and then this is the proportional diversity. The first thing that you can see is that that database does not have complete records in the older time period. So this is the last 50 million years here, basically from about 25 million back. There's no way that's what rodents look like in Europe and North America, or Europe and Asia, right? There are this many in North America in that time period. We just don't have all the records in here. Okay, so work to do, right? So that means I also don't trust a whole lot about what's going on. What I think is you see in the ecology here, because we don't have the thing well sampled, then we don't know what all the ecology was. But once you get past about 25 million going forward, looks like pretty good sampling. Looks like as good as it is, right? And so anything that I can see in the ecological patterns there, I have a reasonable amount of faith is based on a fair amount of data. And one of the things that I can see here is that the taxa in Europe in particular, but also in Asia, are not nearly as high crowned early on as they are in North America. Much more of the North American record are high crowned teeth, are eating abrasive foods, are the kind of taxa we expect to see in open habitats than is the case in Europe and Asia. So what's going on? Why is this different? There's a couple of reasons I think that we see this difference. One of them is habitat. We have some reason to believe from some of the floral records in Europe in particular, paleobotanical records suggest that a lot more of these habitats that are preserved in the European fossil record are forested. And this isn't surprising even today, right? You look at ecosystems today, and much more of Europe is forested than of North America, especially given that the North American fossil record is disproportionately from the Western United States. The Eastern United States is on very old rocks and doesn't have nearly as many vertebrate deposits. And so most of what we're looking at is the West, and the West is dry, it's arid, it's open, right? So that may be a real habitat difference between the two. That's interesting because it suggests we can see some of the diversity of habitat responses when we look at Europe as well as North America. The other thing is, though, that in Eurasia, there's some phylogenetic differences in which taxa are there. So muroid rodents, so rats and mice, are not really much in North America until maybe 5 million years ago. So for most of the time I'm looking at here, rats and mice are all over Europe and Asia, and they're a major part of the fauna, right? Mice and rats are really important to the ecology. And mice and rats, even today, are mostly really low crowned in their teeth. Okay, they're dietary generalists. They'll eat all kinds of things. And even the ones that are specialists, like voles and things like that, have lower crown teeth than you would expect in rodents otherwise. They just don't go crazy with the tooth crown height in the way that that rodents in North America have. So some of that difference may be a habitat difference, and then some of that difference is a difference in which species happen to be there, right? And actually, if you look at some of the later records in North America, when mice and chryseidids in particular get into North America, you see some profound changes in the structure there. You see a little uptick in the number of low-crowned things because, you know, gerbils are happy in grasslands and they live in open habitats with really low-crowned teeth, and they're okay with that. Okay, so a couple of things going on in the teeth, right? What about habitat use? What does the habitat use tell us? Okay, so again, roughly the same, these are the same categories in the same order. They're just slightly different color schemes. Again, we see that sampling bias. We're ignoring everything before about 25 million years ago because we just don't have the data to do it. But this is interesting because where the previous data, where the diet data were suggesting a much later change in diet in European and Asian taxa than in North America, that 30 million year old change in habitat use, the increase in burrowing things, in jumping things, right, does seem to happen at a similar time. So the timing of the change is similar, but the magnitude is still smaller, right? So this is probably that habitat effect again. It's not as big a difference in Europe, maybe a little bit more in Asia. You see a bigger change here, right? But it seems like the habitat effect may be part of it, right? So there is a phylogenetic effect. Again, there are more of these locomotor generalists in the Eurasian record, right? Rats and mice are also capable of doing all of it and not necessarily interested in specializing quite as much, right? And there's more diversity of these guys early on than there is in North America. But there does also seem to be a very distinct difference in habitat use. That said, the timing of change in habitat use is more similar in the European and Asian record to North America than it is for the dietary record. So that's kind of interesting. There's this offset between what's going on in habitat use versus what's going on in diet. In both cases, the North American record seems to see a much more dramatic change. As I said, not entirely surprising given the kind of habitats we have preserved, and in general, what habitats look like between North America and Europe and Asia. Okay. So, so just to kind of summarize what we know from doing this, you do see that the European record and the Asian record are fairly similar in the ways that small mammal ecology changes. The timing of changes and the kind of magnitude of these changes through the Cenozoic is pretty similar between Europe and Asia. Unsurprising because they have a strong continental connection and a lot of exchange of taxa in between. And in fact, even though what's going on habitat-wise in Asia is pretty different from what's going on in Europe, these changes seem to be somewhat correlated. The change in diet represented by the rise of high crown teeth is later and less dramatic in Europe and Asia than it is in North America. The timing of changes in locomotor habits is pretty similar to North America, but it's again less dramatic than it is in North America. So the North American changes that we see, the North American patterns, are not the whole story, right? And so an understanding of even the whole Arctic really requires a more complete data set than we've been using in the past. Okay, so that's kind of a preliminary answer to these questions. That said, this is sort of a like, ooh, this is exciting, the beginning of a lot more work. So you know, one of the things we're doing is working on filling some of the gaps in the record. That North American record, as I said, is really biased by the strong record in the Great Plains. And so we're working in the Northwest where there's a strong fossil record, but it's not as well collected and it's not as well published. The reasons for that have to do with paleontologists not wanting to have to deal with a really complex landscape. So the Great Plains, if you know like your elevation, you know where you are in time, because it's all flat. If you want to work in the Northwest, as Elida experienced, it's all tilted and faulted and folded, and you go from this outcrop to the next one, and you're not even in the same units, and they all look kind of the same, so it's harder. But we're working on adding to the diversity of places in the landscape where we know something about the ecological record. We're also working on filling some of those gaps in the Paleogene of Europe. So we're kind of looking back at the literature and trying to see like what happens if we add that additional data. We're also trying to look at some of the patterns of evolution of ecology within lineages. So I've been very interested in why burrowing evolves within lineages and whether some of what's going on with the habitat use is basically evolutionary novelty of burrowing habits, sort of dropping into open habitats, and of course a lot of burrowers also engineer the habitat to be better for them. That is, if you have something that digs holes, it makes it harder to establish forest. And so there's an interesting question about whether burrowers actually have an effect on the landscape themselves and are affecting the way that the landscape is put together, right? So we're interested in that and how that evolves within lineages, as well as how teeth evolve within lineages. So we've got some ongoing projects having to do with that. So we're trying to look at this holistically, and this is a little bit of a one line of evidence to look at this question, but as part of a bigger picture that we're working on. So with that, thank you for giving me a chance to talk, and thanks to all the people who've worked with us on this project and helped with data gathering and so forth. And I'm happy to take any questions.